Hello and welcome to the Counterpoint podcast. We're closing in on the end of 2020, which has been a tumultuous year, uh, as everyone is painfully aware. So we thought it would be a good idea to take stock, to look at what has happened through 2020 and to look ahead to 2021. And to do that, I'm thrilled to be joined by my great colleague, Tarun Patak. How are you today, Tarun?
Hey Peter, I'm doing very well, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well indeed. So 2020 was, started off actually on a pretty good note. We were expecting the smartphone market to grow a little bit in 2020 after, a few years of decline, right? And then COVID happened, and really kind of started to take hold. I guess, it emerged in China, but really started to take hold in that first quarter, and impacted many sectors. Yeah, and so much has changed since then. I mean, we've got the pandemic to think about, but also, 5G started to take hold. But then on the flip side of that, the action by the US government against Huawei has also been a big disturbance to the normal kind of pattern of things. So, yeah, let's get into this and yeah, talk about what has happened and what we expect to happen. So, just kicking us off, Taryn, what what did we think was going to happen in 2020?
I think, Peter, remember, I think exactly an year back, we were discussing this topic of like what 2020 will be like. And remember, we were discussing this forecast of 2% growth for smartphone market because during the late 2019, the demand was coming back. People were upgrading to a certain extent, and we thought like with 5G coming into picture in 2020, that will give some boost to the overall smartphone shipments, and we projected 2% growth. And now after exactly 1 year, what we are staring at almost like 9% decline for 2020 as compared to 2019. And that predominantly obviously is related to COVID impact, what we have seen starting with late Q1, and then it shifted its epicenter to different countries, different continents, and a lot of things happened during that time. I think we can split it into three main stages. Obviously, one we can look at in the pre-COVID world, and then when the COVID stuck and how the entire industry react. I won't say it as a post-COVID world. We are still very much in the middle of pandemic, but relatively when it started easing out in Q3 or so. So we have seen a very different stages of industry reacting to certain news, reacting to this outbreak in certain countries, and we can talk about it during the course of this discussion. But to start with, I think one main thing which came out of it is the smartphones, what we think are probably one of the last thing people will let go of. So handset demand is resilient. If there is one key takeaway which is there, is we have witnessed the resilient nature of the entire handset market. And I think, Peter, you agree with that, because I remember during the webinar somewhere like end of Q1 or so, you have been like putting this very clearly, like relating it back to your experience during the financial crisis and eventually in 2001 as well, correlating the particular decline. Um, so that is one thing which clearly emerged out of it, and I think you will agree to that, as you have seen that phase as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we do have, when we would, because a lot of our clients are asking us what the potential impact of COVID was. So, we haven't seen anything quite like this before, but our nearest points of comparison with the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then going back to the post .com crash and post 9/11 recession that we saw in 2001, as you say. But the world was, even as recently as 2008, 2009, the the smartphone world was very different. I mean, if you think that the iPhone only really launched in 2007, and in that period we were still going through this very fast growth period. So although we could bring a lot from that, the world has changed. So we needed to think about that.
I think if you look at here, what is happening right now, it is driven more or less by replacement demand, right? People are upgrading their phones. And I think one of the biggest worry for the supply chain is what will happen, whether people will postpone their purchases, what is happening on from the different region, country by country basis. So that has been the one of the biggest question, how consumers will react to this particular situation. Because one thing we obviously know that the demand for smartphone is always like you can say that it will be pushed to a certain extent, and in our experience we believe that not more than 6 months. So this is one of the major assumption we have been taken looking into our forecast. And that's why if you look at a more we revised our forecast to a certain extent, but not like in a significant way. Right now I think we were in that delta of -9 to -14 when we were doing our revisions, right, Peter?
That's right, yeah. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is this generally extending replacement rate in the smartphone market, which has been driven by essentially the quality of smartphones that people are buying, right? So if you buy a smartphone today, it's really so capable, much more really than most people will ever, they barely kind of scratch the surface of what these devices are capable of, and the build quality is now so good that they tend not to break down. I think if you keep one for 2, 3, 4 years, the battery life might trail off a bit, but the quality is good enough that people can say, okay, I can hold on to this thing another 3 months or 4 months. As you say, we had this sort of hypothesis that most people would not extend the natural replacement cycle beyond, let's say, 6 months. But I think COVID was testing that a bit.
Correct. And it varies by region to region and country to country. What we have seen, if we have to summarize these trends, I think it was very much a function of demand and supply, and also a mix of the installed base in the particular countries. So if you look at a lot of the emerging markets, a big chunk of the growth came in the past 2 years in the smartphone market. But for the more developed markets like US or Europe, it has always been there, right? And the average selling price of the phones are what close to like $400, 415 US. Europe almost like $300. But emerging markets, they just came into the action in the past 2 years. So I think installed base mix was a very good indicator to look at how people have been reacting or holding upon to their phones, because obviously for the economies where people have been relying more on the entry tier devices, the wear and tear of these devices during the pandemic has been high. So suddenly you find someone who was using a device for, let's say, 2.5 hours per day in the pre-COVID world, the usage shot up by almost like 40 or 50%, which means a device which he or she was planning to use for another, like, let's say, 6 months or 1 year, that the wear and tear led them to think, okay, do I need to upgrade as well? So there were these two different level of questions which came into front of consumers, like, during this pandemic, should I like hold on to my purchase, or should I invest in something that will last me, like, let's say, for next 2 or 3 years, or a more solid device? And that's why, Peter, if you look at this also reflected on some of the changing strategy for the OEMs. There were OEMs who actually focused a lot on changing their product strategy to more towards the entry tier, because they assume that people will cut down on their budget. And then there were OEMs on the other side of it who thought, okay, maybe we will double down our efforts on the premium or the flagship devices, give more features on top of that. And so there were two different set of strategies which were like these all these trends were highlighting to these OEMs, which makes this situation even more interesting for the entire supply chain in the mid of 2020. And maybe we can talk more from market to the OEM side of things, how they dealt with it.
Yeah, and I think we can potentially kind of carry that forward when we start talking about 2021 and what we expect to see there. I mean, one of the other really interesting things that happened through the initial period of the coronavirus pandemic was this shift to online as a primary sales channel. And I think that if we take India as an example, I mean, India had been shifting online quite fast anyway, but there was this massive shutdown which basically closed everything. So it's interesting to look at how India rebounded and what that did to the sales channels. But even in Europe, which had been shifting to online pretty strongly, and some countries like the UK have this very sophisticated omni-channel approach to retailing. But I think something which commentators have said a lot about coronavirus in relation to technology is that it's sort of advanced trends that were already being seen, but kind of accelerated them. So, maybe we should talk about this channel shift. I mean, can you talk about what's happened in India?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so you have rightly mentioned, like if you look at the entire on the global side of things, right? So if I have to summarize it, still like globally, last year when we exited 2019, almost like 20% of the smartphones were being sold online, 80% was still offline. So that shift has changed significantly in 2020. So like you have rightly mentioned, not just India, but to a certain extent, US, Europe, and you have rightly mentioned that omni channels and in fact I think the MVNOs were a positive factor in the expansion of online channels in Europe, but in India, and obviously the baseline assumption is was the social distancing norms and the push from the OEMs to change their strategies. India as well, like it changed highly in favor of online. I think we exited Q3 with a record online sales. We just finished our yearly Diwali sales here in India, and in the festive season the online sales were astonishingly at almost 66%. So which means like 66% of the smartphones sold during the festive season in India were on online. So that was a big shift, because normal in India, if you look at any normal calendar year in the pre-COVID, that statistic is somewhere closer to like 40 and 60, more in favor of offline. But that was an anomaly in a sense, like festive season. But I think overall we'll see the year ending at 45%, still the highest in the world. And I think the other markets which have been like looking at this trend obviously is Europe, followed by US, like we have recently seen with the Black Friday and other sales concluded in US. The traction has been very strong in more in favor of online. And same we can see in the other parts of world, like China. We have seen, although China is not like very much impacted from the pandemic point of view, obviously the factors there are more macroeconomic rather than pandemic driven. But on a whole, this particular trend we have seen consistently across different regions, be it Middle East Africa or Latam or Southeast Asia or India, China, US, Europe. The shift in online is quite visible right now, as we track these markets across.
Great. So, COVID was one of probably the biggest uh, disruption in 2020, but it wasn't the only one, right? So, as I said at the top of the podcast, we've seen this situation with the US trade war with China, and that's been playing out as well in the telecom space. So, can you talk a little bit about that and what the impact has been?
So that has been like significant. So I think it was one of the most talking event during the year, and there was this discussion. Remember when we were discussing it? We call it as like more like a unglobalization, right? This is a trend which we have seen developing over the past several years, right? Um, it is more like a reversal of globalization. Um, China, we have in the past 2 3 decades, we have always seen China as the epicenter of the world when it comes to the manufacturing, right? The overall ecosystem, ecosystem. Now, what has happened with the China and US trade war, it has basically accelerated that focus on expanding your let's say manufacturing capabilities beyond China, so that it's not like you will pull out of China overnight. That is not happening, but it will be more like a China plus one strategy, which some of the OEMs or the supply chain companies are looking at, because if this thing accelerates in 2021 or 2022, the supply chain should be ready to put their risk on other countries as well. So in that, what has happened, a couple of countries emerged. We have seen a lot of investments in Vietnam happening. India, it was an advantage India to that to a certain extent, because it was not just the expansion from China to India, but we have witnessed another incident in the middle of 2020, which was an unfortunate escalation between border tensions between China and India, and there was rising anti-China sentiments, and as a result of it, government came out with a even more aggressive approach to self-sufficient India, which means you need to incentivize companies to localize production. So that's why it has generated a lot of attention for global suppliers, at least from the consideration set of view. They are looking at Vietnam, they are looking at like Taiwan, they are looking at India to expand, and some parts of Southeast Asia. I think Malaysia can be an attractive destination, um, but then there are other factors which comes into picture. So overall, coming back to your question, Peter, I believe this trend of unglobalization, it won't stop here. I think it will accelerate to a certain extent, because now from here onwards, what we are talking is the investments in technologies will not be just plug and play kind of thing. You won't be just assembling things, right? We are entering into a world where more advanced technologies will come into picture. Like, we have already seen a massive improvement in AI, the machine learning, and the emerging technologies point of view. So if some of these countries, they want to leverage this particular trend, they have to start now, and the best way they can do is they need to accelerate their focus on the domestic manufacturing, and bring the ecosystem together, and not just look at the local consumption point of view, but look at exporting from that country. So that is what you have seen happening from Vietnam, like what is happening from India. Samsung had made one of the biggest factory in the world from India, and they have relocated some of the production from China to Vietnam. So we have seen these changes happening. And although like this thing of geopolitical tensions, they create uncertainty, but there will be opportunities for certain countries to actually ride on this trend and drive their localization efforts going forward.
Hmm. So we could see some redistribution of power. If I can use it, it sounds a bit grand, but some redistribution of power within the overall supply chain over the next year or so. But I guess most in focus in 2020 has been Huawei, um, and we had this curious situation earlier in the year where, despite the fact that Huawei was in the firing line, it actually became briefly the number one smartphone player in terms of shipment volume, right?
Yeah, that's true. That happened in Q2. Again, one of the main talking point during one of these trends is like the demand at that time. If you look at in Q2, what happened in like China was coming out of the pandemic, but the rest of the countries in the world, the escalation in the virus, the cases, the lockdown has started happening. So what happened is, what happened at the time was Huawei, which is very much dependent on China, and it is one of the leading player over there. I think no other brand has this much of grip in their domestic market. Like Huawei at one point of time, I think if it was August, they had almost like 46 or 47% of the Chinese smartphone market. So that worked to their advantage, and they became the number one briefly. But as you know, what happened after that, the US added more entities to their um to the list of banned companies, and then the issue with the TSMC, they could no longer procure chips. They had to change their sourcing strategy. Android was has always been a major challenge for them to expand their share outside China. So that was a bit unfortunate for a company that has truly leveraged its vertically integrated strengths in the past 3 or 4 years, when we have seen Huawei rising to the ranks to become almost like within the top three smartphone players in the world. Um, so that is again, I think one interesting development which is still happening, right? We are now looking into what is happening on the SMIC side of things. So these kind of events create a lot of uncertainty in the market, and it could be an opportunity for other players to a certain extent. Like the fall of Huawei could be an opportunity for players like Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi to a certain extent. But then we have also seen the events changing place when Honor was sold and separated from Huawei. Uh, and that's again one of the big discussion point is what will happen in 2021 once Honor is independent, whether they will be able to like source components in a similar way, whether they are going to increase their market share. That still remains to be seen, but in a sense we can see that it was a positive development from Huawei's point of view, that they will have no more cash, at least to start with, and look into the areas where they have been very strong in the network infrastructure side of things, at least in the China market to start with.
Yes. And, one of Huawei's great strengths has been its leading position in 5G technology, both in terms of infrastructure, as you just mentioned, but also on the device side. So 5G really kind of got going it was launched in 2019 and beginning to gain momentum in some countries in 2020, despite the pandemic. So maybe we should talk about that, because I think we've actually upped our forecast for 5G during 2020 because the prices of 5G phones have come down pretty quickly, right? So where are we now relative to 5G? Obviously, we had Apple launching just a couple of months ago the iPhone 12 portfolio, which is all 5G. So are we now seeing a kind of strong consumer pull for 5G, or is it more supply push, would you say?
So I'll say like 5G again, one of the interesting development of 2020. As of now, it is, if you look at one of the biggest market, China, right now. So let's dissect the number again in that scenario. So in 2020, we are estimating almost like 240 plus million 5G devices to be sold in 2020. Next year, we are projecting close to like over 580 million plus, that will contribute to roughly like 38% of the overall smartphone market, which in a sense is much stronger than the initial 4G uptake what we have seen in 3 or 4 years back. So from that perspective, it is positive to a certain extent, but a lot of this 5G is still being pushed. It's a supply chain push right now. So in markets other than like US, Korea, Japan or China, we have not. We are still seeing operators launching their networks. So if you look at the where we are right now in the current state of 5G deployment, I think there is a very positive angle to that. We are approaching almost like 100 operators with commercially deployed 5G networks. Almost like 300 plus additional operators are investing in 5G. And things are pretty much positive when it comes to the 5G deployment across the globe. It's happening in sub-6 and millimeter wave in certain countries. And one of the biggest country here, I'll say China. So that is a little bit of a concern, not a concern in a scenario, but if you look at the right now, 60% of the new devices which are launched are 5G devices. But the consumer uptake, the China market has not grown in a similar fashion that we have expected in the past. So if you look at in 2020, we are estimating China market will decline almost 16% year on year in 2020, and then we are estimating a growth of 6%. As compared to 9% decline of the global smartphone market and 13% growth of the global smartphone market in 2021, which means China market will grow comparatively slower than the overall smartphone market. So that has been a cause of concern, because it indicates two things, which means like users are not upgrading their phone frequently, in a sense, like they have been doing in the past. And other thing, what we have seen from the macroeconomic point of view, is the China economy grew by just 5% in Q3. The unemployment rate has been comparatively higher. I think what is happening is the rural urban unemployment rate is bearing a lot. So if you look at a lot of the users who are in the rural side of China, they were driving this entry to mid-tier smartphone segment in China. So they are holding to their devices for longer, and they are not upgrading, because China market, 95% of the growth is driven by upgrades, right? So that is not growing like everyone expected. So if that happens in 2021 or 2022, then it will be a big push to 5G. But if we look at the 5G side of story in the US side, that is more or less a very positive one. So Apple has just launched a 5G iPhone 12 series, and if you look at the response to that, has been very solid. We are seeing very strong sales of iPhone 12 series, which is indicating that a lot of consumers are upgrading their devices in US. A strong indicator to the next coming, let's say, a couple of quarter growth for iPhones in US. So that is happening, I think, which is a positive development for the acceleration of 5G adoption in US. And then Korea and Japan have been going very strong too. So I believe it will be like a balance between China and what is happening in the rest of the world. But if China starts growing, like next year it will grow by 6%, then we'll see even major push to the 5G adoption in the world. But I think you have mentioned a very interesting point on the ASP side of things. So if you look at the ASP, that has declined much faster as well. So for example, if we look at 5G, I think last year when we exited 2019, we were looking close to like $750 or so. And this year we might end up at looking at 26% decline in the 5G ASP, and a further decline in 2021 as well, which means the 5G smartphones are diffusing to lower price points much faster than 4G in the 4G era, and that will drive the adoption as well. We have already seen the BOM cost or even the cheaper 5G devices as low as like $150 in China, which means that that very much uh, will be a likely scenario in the um, uh, rest of the world, or in some of the markets like India or Southeast Asia or European markets as well.
Yes, when thinking about some of the other parts of the world, I'm sitting here in the UK. I mean, what we've seen is a pretty muted consumer response to 5G, but a strong response to the iPhone 12. So I think consumers are, motivated by the latest iPhone model, but they're getting 5G almost as a bonus. It's not really the kind of key driving factor in their purchase decision. And I think that's also being kind of replicated in a number of other markets. So 5G is not a primary driving factor, but it's kind of creeping in. Yeah, maybe not by the back door, but it's sort of coming in as a consequence of the fact that OEMs are outfitting their products with 5G. And we're seeing sales of 5G devices in countries that won't actually launch a 5G network for several more quarters or potentially even longer, right? So, but 5G is kind of one innovation. But what else have we seen in terms of development in smartphone specification over the last few months? And maybe we can also start switching gears. You've been talking about 2021 a bit more in terms of volumes, what we're expecting to see there, but thinking, turning our sort of attention a little bit to the future. How do we see the, likely innovation moving as we go into next year?
Right. So Peter, interesting you brought this up. So if you look at right now, maybe the 5G adoption, how 4G came into picture was more of the apps, right? The use cases. So potentially it will be very much tied up to the use cases, which will be brought up in the later stages, like maybe in 21, 22. Obviously 5G was one of the innovation or the feature set within the overall device specifications, but there are a lot of other things which got the attention in 2020, and then predominantly going into 2021 we might see more of the innovative features. And if you look at a little bit deeper here, these feature sets are very much tied to how consumers are using their phone, especially in this new normal, the pandemic. For example, when people were working from home, a lot of people started using their devices, consuming more content. So you have seen the importance of displays going up. And that's the reason if in 2020 we have discussed a lot about refresh rates, like 120 hertz. We have seen refresh rates going up to 144 hertz. So what is happening is the use cases, what consumers are like looking at right now, it they have changed significantly. So someone were consuming a lot of content on the TVs, let's say they have started looking at the content on the devices, and the preference for the displays goes up. And that is why if you look at 2020, the adoption of the OLED screen have gone up. People were very particular about their aspect ratio of their devices. They wanted end-to-end displays, so that the viewing area is large and the experience is more. And the same trend will go, we'll see happening in 2021 as well. We have seen the changing form factors as well. Like the foldable is one. I think it introduced last year, but the second or the third iteration of the foldables will be the really one when we'll start talking more about the adoption of these new form factors within the user's preference group. So what will happen, what we believe that it has very much to do with how users are looking at. So for example, a lot of people started looking at gaming when they were like in the middle of pandemic or lockdown. We have seen a sudden surge in the gamers across, and this is a trend. I'm not talking about just one country or so. That has been universal across different regions, different countries. So when the gaming like content went up, we have seen people going for like better displays. They were looking for improved AI ML level capabilities in their devices. They were searching for chipset which were actually faster. um, and that's why some of these supply chain or component players tweak their strategies. We have seen gaming specific chipset coming into picture, and the devices OEM pushed in 2020 were much larger as compared to 2019. Then we have seen other areas. So for example, to look at the display, talking about, because display and the gaming, and if we look at these are the two major features which were like most sought after in during 2020. And what we believe is in 2021 these things will change a bit. People will start going out to a certain extent, and then the preferences will be more on the, let's say, battery, the overall software hardware integration. It could be more on the cameras if people started going out and clicking more pictures. It could be more on the fast charging. So if I have to summarize all the feature sets which were like, we have seen a massive increase in 2020. If we look at the last year comparison, I think when we were at the beginning of 2019, quad camera setup contributed to only 12% of the total smartphones. And by the end of 2020, we have seen the penetration somewhere closer to 40%. And in 2021, we believe that quad camera, these specifications will further diffuse to lower price points, which means more adoption. So it can go up to like 64% or so. And similar applies to NAND flash as well. So what we are believing is, in the next 3 to 4 years, the average consumption on the NAND flash side of things will increase by almost 3 times. Looking at the use cases from the 5G side of things, because we do not know what exactly the use cases which will be very popular once we are into the middle of real 5G. It could be like somewhere like virtual reality, augmented reality, and I believe, Peter, you have been researching this topic in greater detail. All these use cases which could actually bump up the demand for certain specifications. It could be like improved camera, it could be like faster charging, and we have already seen 65-watt charging in 2020. Who knows, next year it will be like closer to like even more than touching 100 or so. And the camera capabilities, we have already seen 100 megapixel supporting cameras. It could be even like more in 2021. So all these feature sets have bumped in 2020, and the adoption will see further increase in 2021 within the device set.
Yeah. So we need to start bringing this to a close shortly. But thinking about 2021, I mean, we have, coronavirus is still around, and we talked a bit about the new strain of the virus, which has been discovered mainly in the UK, but it's already being seen in other markets, which, according to the scientists in the UK, transmits more readily than the original COVID-19 virus, which is concerning, obviously. And I think it's what we've seen over the last year is that it's been a very difficult virus to contain, so it's likely to continue spreading. We do have vaccines coming through, which is good news, but that obviously takes time to roll out, and there are certain challenges in getting the vaccine to every part of the world. So this pandemic is going to be with us for some months to come. So we have to continue to consider that as a factor in the overall market. What we've also seen more recently is this considerable strain on the supply chain for the smartphone market, right? So as Huawei went through these through this sort of turbulent phase, and many of the other OEMs figured that they could win that market share that had been there with Huawei. They've been putting in orders, and demand has risen perhaps beyond the total addressable market size, as all of these players think that they can take that market share. But we've also, a lot of the technologies that you've just been talking about demand much higher content for things like power management ICs, and new display technologies require other components that go along with that, and all of those are under pressure as well. So we have this confluence of events still that are likely to pervade into 2021. So trying to kind of bring all this together, I mean, I think we feel a bit more positive about 2021. So we have what look like decent growth rates, but we always have to remember that those are growth rates, on a year-over-year basis compared to 2020, which has been severely impacted. So where does 2021 sit in our current estimation, relative to the long run growth rate? Are we kind of bouncing back to where it might otherwise have been, or are we still a bit down on that kind of long run view?
Yeah. So if you look at, if you compare 2021 with 2019, we are still looking at 3% growth. As you have rightly pointed that if we compare it with 2020, it will show as a 13% growth, but then 2020 has been severely impacted due to COVID. But 3% growth is still better, right? And one thing within this trend we need to look at is the average selling price. For the smartphones were also what we are projecting is more or less flat for 2021, which means that even with the growth rate of the smartphone market, we will still maintain the similar level of ASPs, even if some of the users start cutting on their budgets in some markets, but that will be equally taken care of for the fact that the brands like Apple, Samsung, and to a certain extent like Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi, they have been trying to put a lot of their resources on the mid to high tier of the devices. So what you will see is in 2021, if I have to conclude it with different set of strategies, so what OEMs will look at is, one thing is what 2020 have taught them is how to manage like a particular, how to navigate these trends. So for example, if there is a lot of uncertainty, let's assume the new strain adds more pressure, more lockdown kind of scenarios, then I think a lot of these OEMs will be better prepared in 2021 as compared to 2020, and they can decide the market growth or demand in a much better way as they would have done in 2020. And similar trend applies to the component players as well. If we look at, we have seen this Q4 normally is a big jump. Obviously, Apple launch and a lot of consumer in the developed markets upgrade. But then we also have a series of lower growth rate quarters, like Q1, Q2 normally is like more or less silent, and then we start looking at demand picking up in Q3, Q4. So they can navigate these trends much better as compared to 2020. But like we discussed in the beginning, I think the best way to look at any kind of like hypothesis on the market growth is look at the installed base of the respective countries and how they are reacting to that. If you have seen a certain country in Q4 growing significantly, which means the bulk of the user base have already purchased their devices, which means the next quarter will be a bit lower. So what I believe is, if you look at the brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, OnePlus, Samsung, Apple, um, Huawei to a certain extent, they'll be keeping a very closer eye on the supply side of things and the demand side of things and try to balance it out based on their projections. And what will add, what we have seen in 2020 is also the emergence of new use cases. We have seen the additional growth added to the smartphone market because of like work from home or kids learning from home, which otherwise could not have bought a phone at, like, let's say 14 years or less than that. They have got access to the phones. So there were some additional factors as well that every brand needs to weigh in and then decide on what, how they are looking at the respective markets. And if all these OEMs I have talked to, they are also expanding in other markets. So that is again a particular area of uncertainty for them, because uh, like getting a exact volume what you can get from a new country of expansion is very, very tricky. So they need to be very careful on how they are placing orders for these new country of expansion. Because if you look at right now, almost all the top five brands, obviously Apple and Samsung, they have massive reach across different countries. But other than that, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, Realme, OnePlus, they are expanding faster in new countries. Like, and Peter, I think Europe, the area you are covering and where you are right now, you are finding a lot of action over there from most of these brands as well, right?
Yes, indeed. That I think they perceive probably correctly that there is a big opportunity. The European region, though, is difficult to penetrate because it's rather fragmented with many different countries, different operators. The balance of channels varies quite a bit between countries, so they have to take a very measured approach. But there is good opportunity here. But I think we've probably exhausted our allocated time today, Tarun. And I think just want to thank you for what has been a fascinating discussion. And I continue to be amazed at your grasp of detail. I can only dream of having such fingertip reach into the many aspects of this market. So thank you very much.
Likewise, Peter. Thanks. Yeah, it was nice talking to you. I'm sure like we'll find more time discussing this. I don't think we can summarize this in one session, but yeah, it has been like that kind of a year, like where we can just talk and talk and talk about the developments happened.
Indeed, and it's been a fascinating year, and I think 2021 promises to be even more so. So yeah, it just remains for us to wish our clients and our listeners very happy holidays and wish everyone the very best for 2021.
Yes. Hopefully, 2021 brings in best for everyone. Yeah. Thanks, Peter.
Great. Thanks, Taryn, and thanks everyone for listening. And check in next time for the next installment of the Counterpoint podcast. So many thanks and have a great rest of the year and looking forward to 2021 with you. All the best. Bye now.